Hi all, welcome to the Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien, either is fine. And as you know, the Wife of Caesar is Streiner's project to talk about corruption or anti-corruption using everyday language so that we can fight corruption in our day-to-day lives with a little bit more than just good intentions. As in every show, we will have a piece of news, a case, and a typology. When we talk about the news, we will talk about current events that have some type of nexus or relationship with corruption or anti-corruption. When we talk about the case, we will discuss general or relevant or important cases that have been resolved recently and deal with corruption or anti-corruption. And when we talk about the typology, we will discuss the different ways in which corruption can occur. Okay, let's go to the news. In the news this week, we had the case of Riza Aziz. Now, he is the stepson to the former Prime Minister of Malaysia. He's also famous or notorious for producing the movies Wolf of Wall Street and Dumb and Dumber 2. Now, what happened this week is that Mr. Aziz was he has been under investigation in connection with the 1MDB scandal, which we will discuss in a bit. And my apologies, for graft. So he's been under investigation for graft in the 1MDB scandal. And the 1MDB scandal, for those of you who don't know, is a corruption scandal, one of the largest corruption scandals in modern day, that deals with iterations or instances of graft committed against the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia. For those of you who don't know, a sovereign wealth fund essentially is a large account, money and wealth that is owned by a government, by a country, and it is liquid wealth, and that government or that country places that money into the market, into investments. And the idea is to make that money grow, make those investments more fructiferous to benefit the people. One example of sovereign wealth funds is the Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the largest fund or investment fund in existence, valued at around $1 trillion. So that's sovereign wealth funds for you. Okay. In the 1MDB scandal, the Malaysian authorities performed several investigations, and they realized that different actors committed graft for about $4.5 billion against the sovereign wealth fund. These figures are estimated by the United States Department of Justice, who has also been involved in investigations somehow. We will discuss the 1MDB scandal in another show. But that's a little bit of background for you. Now, Mr. Aziz has been involved in these investigations forever and since the beginning. Now, in this case, he was accused of grafting and laundering $248 million off of the 1MDB fund. And he was arrested this week by the Malaysian Anticorruption Commission, which performs functions of investigation and prosecution in Malaysia in cases dealing specifically with corruption and anti-corruption. He was released under bail and he is still awaiting trial. And as soon as any new developments come to rise, we will keep an eye out for them and let you know. All right, so let's move on to the case. Today we have Technip yet again. Now I said yet again because everyone who is in corruption or anti-corruption has studied the Technip case of 2010, one of the major enforcement actions under the FCPA. This happened back then, and it has happened, or Technip has been involved in corruption scandals yet again this week. Okay, to give you a little bit of background, in 2010, let's do a little bit of a timeline here. In 2010, Technip was accused and found guilty of paying bribes in Nigeria to obtain oil contracts. But before we move on to that, Technip, as we've discussed in previous episodes, is a company that specializes in constructing technology and infrastructure for the oil refining industry. Back in 2010, the company signed an agreement with the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, and agreed to pay a fine for $340 million. This was in the context of essentially the company was found, a lot of officials and executives in the company were found guilty of paying bribes. So the company was found itself guilty of paying bribes, and it agreed to settle the case with a fine. Now, in 2016, a different company, FMC, who is also in a similar industry, in the business of developing technology and infrastructure for the oil industry, was accused of violations to the books and records provision of the FCPA. Now, FMC settled this case under what was called a non-FCPA FCPA enforcement action, which is kind of confusing. All we need to know is that the company was accused of violating certain provisions of the FCPA, and it agreed to pay a fine to settle those claims. Okay. Now, the authorities of the US found that it was more than likely that executives in FMC had paid bribes, and the company signed an agreement or an order with the SEC. Now, in this agreement, it wasn't the type of agreement that we usually discuss, because in most of those agreements, companies, one of the basic requirements is that the company has to admit to paying bribes, to committing corruptions. That's kind of one of the major stipulations. In this case, not so much. FMC signed an agreement with the SEC stating essentially, I will not confirm nor deny that I paid a bribe, but here's a bunch of money to settle this issue. Now, they paid $1 million, which is, to be quite honest, a low amount for this particular fact pattern. But in the same year, FMC and Technip decided to merge. My apologies. To merge. And the value of the deal was around $13 billion. So the merger, or the successor company, the company that resulted from the merger, the new company, is valued at around $13 billion. Our best guess is that the SEC and FMC wanted to settle this as quietly and as quickly as possible so that they could move the deal along, move the merger deal along. Okay, now further, in 2019, the Mexican government decided that it wanted to tender out to tender out the construction for a new refinery, a new oil refinery in Mexico. And instead of holding a public invitation where any company that felt that they could compete would submit their proposals, the Mexican government decided to invite 6 particular companies. And we discussed this at length in a previous episode. And one of the things that we mentioned in that episode was that it wasn't exactly a mistake to invite a company that had previously settled corruption cases, because, as we mentioned, it is very rare for lightning to strike twice in the same place. What happened here is that lightning did strike twice in the same place, and yeah, more cases of corruption came out of Technip. Also relevant was that the refinery was not awarded to Technip. It's actually not been awarded to any company. The Mexican government took it in a different direction. So in the end, it was relatively safe for the government. Now, what happened in the new case this year, in 2019, was that Technip was implicated in bribery payments in Brazil and Iraq. My apologies. Brazil and Iraq. And this information arose from the Petrobras investigation and, of course, Lava Jato, the tree that keeps on giving. Okay, now Technip, the 2 companies were involved in this matter, Technip USA and Technip FMC. Technip FMC is the parent, Technip USA is the subsidiary. Technip USA was accused of paying around $26 million in bribes to the Brazil Workers' Party, and it signed a plea bargaining agreement and paid a fine of $500,000 US dollars. Now, plea bargaining agreement is yes an agreement that's signed between the accused company and the government, but it is essentially an agreement where at the beginning of the trial, the company will be asked how it pleads, and the company decides to plead guilty in exchange for certain conditions, and those conditions are specified in the agreement. The fine is very, very low, but I will explain in a minute why that is. Now, the parent, Technip FMC, also was accused of paying bribes in Brazil and paying bribes in Iraq in connection with obtaining contracts for public contracts. And the parent, Technip FMC, decided to sign a DPA, a deferred prosecution agreement, with the government, which is, as we've mentioned many times before, I will agree not to take you to trial as long as you meet certain conditions. And one of those conditions was to pay a fine of $81 million. Again, a relatively small fine, but these fines, two things happened here. The $81 million fine is actually $81.8 million, and it also includes the $500,000 already agreed to be paid by Technip USA. Also, because Technip already has a very robust compliance anti-corruption program, and these conducts were obviously the company cooperated with the authorities in investigating these conducts, the authorities decided to assign a lower fine, even lower than the minimum set forth in these sentencing guidelines. This isn't out of the ordinary, because the fine that was paid in 2010 was so high, and the one that was paid in this year is complementary or considered complementary to that fine. We tend to feel that the company or the authorities approach the topic as if the company had paid an entire whole amount of 340 plus 81. So that's the reason for that amount. Okay, so let's move on to the typology. Today we have the revolving door. A revolving door is a phenomenon that's been mentioned in the news many times, and we will talk about it and tell you essentially what it is. Okay, so Transparency International has defined the revolving door phenomenon as the movement of people from the public sector to the private sector, or vice versa, in exchange for improper benefits. So the way it manifests, what actually happens is one person holds a position in the public sector or the private sector, and after a few years of obtaining experience and making acquaintances and obtaining relations, they decide to switch sides, so to speak, and then use the knowledge and position gained in the other side to benefit the new position. Okay, and the way it takes four forms essentially. You can move from the public sector to the private sector, so you work as a government official and you decide after your tenure to move to a company that performs in an industry that is related to the work you did as a public official. Obviously, there's potential for abuse there because you can use privileged information that you gained in your tenure as a public official to benefit the private company. Another way in which it happens is you can move from the private sector to the public sector, and the idea behind this is you spend some time in a private company, then you move to the public sector in an area related to the company that you left, and you use your new position to benefit your old company in exchange, of course, for money. Third way in which it occurs is you move from lobbying to the public sector. Lobbying, for those of you who don't remember, is the profession of promoting bills, legislation, and regulation from the private sector. So it is a person that holds a job in the private sector, and her job is solely to reach out to legislators, lawmakers, and policymakers and convince them to pass laws and regulation and policy that will allegedly benefit the company, yes, but also the public in general. Now, these people are, this job is legal, and these people are in heavy contact with the public sector. So they have, over the years, they develop many relations and hold some influence, in those relations. When they leave the lobbying, the private sector, their lobbying jobs, and move to the public sector, they can abuse that position to advance the policies that they were promoting from the private sector. And this can happen the other way around too. They can also move from the public sector to lobbying and abuse the relations and the knowledge that they gained during their tenure as a public servant to favor their new lobbying positions. Now, most countries have laws regulating revolving doors, and most of them are fairly inefficient for several reasons. One of them being that it's quite hard to regulate the right to free employment. Every person has the right to have whatever job they choose and they lawfully gain. So how can the government limit that or regulate that? It's a very slippery slope. And for example, in Mexico, the current Mexican laws have a chilling period of 1 year. Essentially, the current laws state that for 1 year after you leave your tenure or your position as a public servant, you cannot work in an industry that's related to that field. Now, reform has been enacted to modify this law and extend that chilling period to 10 years and to limit that limitation to companies that you regulated or oversaw as a public servant, which to me makes a lot of sense. That means that you can work as a public servant and then leave right away and begin working in a company in a related industry, so long as you didn't oversee, supervise, or regulate that company. Of course, this has yet to evolve into more specific regulation and application in public policy, so we don't know yet how it will play out, but of course we will keep you posted. Research for the typology was provided by Ms. Laura Paola Villa. Thank you for that. And that is it. Okay, so I will leave you today, as always, with the same message. Please blow the whistle. Every act of corruption has to be denounced, but do it safely. If you're not sure of whether or not what you're witnessing is corruption, or you're not sure whether or not you're physically safe, your integrity is protected, don't do anything. Refrain from blowing the whistle. Reach out to people who can help you. Reach out to us at info@streiner.mx and we will be glad to help you. But above all, stay safe. So this has been The Wife of Caesar. Thank you for being with us. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien, either is fine, and have a happy Monday.